I applied for a mortgage to downsize after my wife died, and the bank denied my application. Said I already owned 4 properties, but I only own one house, the one I've lived in for 40 years. The bank showed me deeds, mortgage documents, property tax records, 4 houses in different states, all purchased between 2008 and 2015, all in my name, all with mortgages I'd supposedly been paying for years. Then they showed me the co-signer on all 4 mortgages, my wife, Helen, who died in 2007, a year before the first property was purchased. Someone had been signing mortgage documents in her name for 8 years after she was dead. Someone had been living a parallel financial life using both our identities. And according to the bank's records, that someone was me. My name is Robert Hayes. I'm 72 years old. I live in Columbus, Ohio. I've lived in the same house for 40 years, a 3-bedroom ranch on the west side of the city. My wife Helen and I bought it in 1984 when I was 36, and she was 34. We raised our daughter Sarah there, watched her grow up in those rooms, sent her off to college from that front porch, celebrated holidays in that living room, built a life inside those walls. Helen died in 2007, cancer. She was 61 years old, too young. We'd been married for 38 years, high school sweethearts, got married right after I finished college, had Sarah 2 years later. Helen had been a teacher, elementary school, 3rd grade. She'd loved it, loved the kids, came home every day with stories about what they'd said or done. She'd taught for 35 years before the cancer made it impossible to continue. After Helen died, the house felt too big, too empty, too full of memories that hurt to look at. Her favorite chair, her coffee mug still in the cabinet, her handwriting on the grocery list stuck to the refrigerator. I'd left everything exactly as it was. Couldn't bring myself to change anything. For 17 years, I'd been living in a museum of our marriage, surrounded by Helen but unable to touch her. Sarah had been after me for years to move, said the house was too much for me to maintain, that I should sell it, get something smaller, easier to manage, a condo maybe, or one of those senior living communities, somewhere I wouldn't have to worry about yard work and repairs and all the maintenance a house required. She was right. I knew she was right. But moving meant letting go of Helen, meant admitting she was really gone, meant starting over without her. But by 2024, 17 years after Helen's death, I was finally ready to downsize, ready to move forward, ready to build whatever life I had left in a space that wasn't so haunted by the past. I'd be 72 in a few months, still healthy, still active, but I wasn't getting any younger. If I was going to move, now was the time. I started looking at condos, 2 bedrooms, low maintenance, in neighborhoods close to where Sarah lived with her family. I found one I liked. Good location, good price, small enough that I could manage it but big enough for Sarah and my grandkids to visit. It felt right, felt like a new beginning. The realtor suggested I get pre-approved for a mortgage before making an offer. Said it would strengthen my position, make the seller take me seriously. I'd be paying mostly cash from the sale of my house, but I'd need a small mortgage to cover the difference. Maybe $50,000 or $60,000. Should be simple. I had good credit, a pension, Social Security, no debt. The bank should approve me without any issues. I went to the bank on a Tuesday morning in March. Same bank I'd been with for 40 years, where Helen and I had opened our first joint account back in 1976, where we'd gotten our mortgage for the house, where I'd deposited my paychecks for decades. I knew the people there. They knew me. This should have been routine. The loan officer was a woman named Jennifer, maybe 40 years old, professional, friendly. She pulled up my information on her computer, asked about the property I wanted to buy, the amount I needed to borrow, my income, standard questions. I answered everything, gave her my tax returns, my bank statements, my pension documentation, everything she needed. Jennifer typed information into her computer, then stopped, stared at the screen. Her expression changed from professional friendliness to confusion. She asked me to wait a moment, picked up her phone, called someone, had a quiet conversation I couldn't quite hear, hung up, told me her manager needed to speak with me, that there was some kind of issue with my application. The manager was a man named David, maybe 50. He came out of his office looking serious, asked me to come back with him, led me to a conference room, closed the door, sat across from me with a folder full of papers. He asked me how many properties I currently owned. I said 1. My house, the one I'd lived in for 40 years, the one I was planning to sell. David opened the folder, showed me documents, mortgage statements, property deeds, tax records. He said according to their records and the credit bureaus, I owned 5 properties. my house in Columbus, and 4 others, one in Phoenix, Arizona, one in Tampa, Florida, one in Charlotte, North Carolina, one in Nashville, Tennessee, all purchased between 2008 and 2015, all with active mortgages, all in my name. I said that was impossible. I'd never bought property in any of those cities, never even visited most of them. I only owned one house. My house? The one I'd lived in for 40 years. David said he understood this was confusing, but the records were clear. Property deeds filed with county governments, mortgages with major lenders, tax payments, insurance, everything documented, everything showing I'd been buying and maintaining properties for the past 16 years. He showed me the first deed, a house in Phoenix, purchased in 2008 for $240,000. The OFAM deed had my name, my social security number, my signature, except I'd never signed that document, never been to Phoenix in 2008, never bought a house there. David showed me the mortgage paperwork, a 30-year mortgage, payments of about $1,500 a month, all supposedly paid on time for 16 years, $240,000 I'd supposedly borrowed and been repaying. Then David showed me something that made my chest tighten, the co-signer line. Helen Hayes, my wife, with her signature, her social security number, her income listed as a teacher. But Helen had died in 2007, a year before this house was supposedly purchased. Someone had forged her signature on a mortgage document after she was dead. David showed me the other properties. Tampa, purchased in 2010, $260,000. Same thing, my name, my signature, and Helen's name as co-signer. Helen, who'd been dead for 3 years when this house was supposedly bought. Charlotte, purchased in 2012, $280,000. Helen listed as co-signer 5 years after her death. Nashville, purchased in 2015, $300,000. Helen as co-signer 8 years after she died. I sat there staring at these documents, feeling like reality had fractured. Someone had been buying houses in my name for 16 years. Someone had been forging Helen's signature. Someone had been making mortgage payments from somewhere. Someone had been living a parallel financial life using our identities. And according to these records, that someone was me. I told David this was fraud, identity theft, that someone had stolen my information and Helen's, that someone had been using our names to buy properties, that I'd never signed any of these documents, never bought any of these houses, never even heard of most of these addresses. David said he believed me, but that the situation was complicated. The mortgages had all been paid on time for years. No late payments, no defaults. Someone had been maintaining these properties, paying taxes, paying insurance, living in them or renting them out. This wasn't typical identity theft where someone steals your information and disappears. This was something more sophisticated. David said he'd need to report this. That identity theft of this magnitude, especially involving a deceased person's identity, required investigation. He'd contact the fraud department. They'd open a case. They'd investigate. But in the meantime, my mortgage application was denied. I couldn't get a new mortgage until this was resolved, until they understood what was happening, until they knew whether I was a victim or somehow complicit. I asked how I could be complicit. My wife was dead. Someone was forging her signature years after her death. That proved this wasn't me. David agreed that part was suspicious, but he had to follow procedures, had to report it, had to let the investigators figure out what was happening. He gave me paperwork, case numbers, contact information for the fraud department, said someone would be in touch, that I should gather any documentation I had, anything that proved where I'd been and what I'd been doing when these properties were supposedly purchased. I left the bank feeling like I'd been punched. This didn't make sense. None of it made sense. I drove home in a daze, sat in my driveway staring at my house, the house Helen and I had bought in 1984, the only house I'd ever owned, the only property that was real. But according to the bank, I owned 4 others. According to legal documents filed in 4 different states, I'd been buying and maintaining properties for 16 years, living some kind of double life I knew nothing about. I went inside, pulled out my files, started looking for proof I'd been here, proof I hadn't been in Phoenix or Tampa or Charlotte or Nashville, proof I'd been living my ordinary life in Columbus, working my job, coming home every evening, being exactly where I was supposed to be. I'd worked for the same company for 40 years, a manufacturing firm. I'd been in management, operations. I'd retired in 2015, had a retirement party, a pension, all documented. I pulled out my employment records, showed continuous work from 1974 to 2015. No gaps, no leaves of absence, no unexplained absences. If I'd been buying houses in other states, when would I have done it? I'd been at work every day, coming home every evening, living my routine. I pulled out tax returns, decades of them, all showing income from my job, from my pension after retirement. Nothing unusual. No income from rental properties. No deductions for mortgage interest on multiple properties. Just normal tax returns showing a normal life. I pulled out bank statements, going back years, all showing normal expenses. Mortgage payment on my house, utilities, groceries, insurance. Nothing indicating I was paying for properties in 4 other states. Nothing showing $1,500 payments every month to mortgages I didn't know about. My finances were simple, straightforward. No hidden accounts, no mysterious transfers, just an ordinary financial life. But somehow, somewhere, someone had been using my name to buy houses. Someone had been making mortgage payments that didn't show up in my bank accounts. Someone had been maintaining properties I knew nothing about. Someone had been living a financial life parallel to mine, using my identity, using Helen's identity, creating documents and records that looked legitimate. That fooled banks and county governments and credit bureaus. The fraud department called 2 days later. A woman named Karen. She said she'd been assigned to my case, that she'd reviewed the basic information, that she needed to meet with me, go through everything in detail, understand what had happened. She asked if I could come to their offices, bring all my documentation, my employment records, my tax returns, my bank statements, anything that proved I was who I said I was, that I'd been living where I said I'd been living, that I hadn't been buying houses in 4 different states. I met with Karen the following Monday, brought boxes of documents, 40 years of financial records, employment records, tax returns, bank statements, utility bills, everything I could find that proved I'd been living an ordinary life in Columbus, that I'd been exactly where I was supposed to be, that I wasn't the person who'd been buying houses in other states. Karen went through everything, took copies, made notes, asked questions about Helen, when she'd died, where she'd been buried, her death certificate, her social security number, whether anyone else might have had access to her information. I gave her everything, Helen's death certificate, her obituary, photos from the funeral, proof she'd been dead since 2007, proof she couldn't have been co-signing mortgages in 2008, 2010, 2012, and 2015. Karen asked about family. Did I have anyone who might have done this? Anyone who could have used my identity? I said no. My daughter Sarah wouldn't do this. She had her own life, her own career, her own family. She had no reason to steal my identity, no reason to forge her mother's signature on mortgage documents. My sisters lived in other states. We weren't close. They had no access to my information, no motive to do this. Karen asked if anyone else had access to my financial information, my social security number, my bank accounts. I said no, just me, Helen when she was alive, but no one else, no one who could have done this. Karen said she'd investigate, would contact the mortgage companies, the title companies, the banks that had issued these loans, would try to track down who'd actually signed the documents, who'd been making the payments, who'd been living in these houses. She said this could take months, that fraud investigations were complex, that she'd need to work with authorities in multiple states, that I should prepare for this to be a long process, but that in the meantime, I should check my credit reports, make sure there wasn't other fraud I didn't know about, make sure my identity wasn't being used for other things. I went home and pulled my credit reports, all 3 bureaus, looked through them carefully. The 4 mortgages were all listed, Phoenix, Tampa, Charlotte, Nashville, all showing on-time payments, all showing outstanding balances, but there was nothing else unusual. No other loans, no other credit cards, no other accounts I didn't recognize, just those 4 mortgages, 4 houses I supposedly owned but knew nothing about. Sarah came over that evening. I'd told her about the bank denying my mortgage application, told her about the 4 properties supposedly in my name, told her about Helen's name being on documents signed after her death. Sarah was shocked, couldn't believe it, asked how this was possible, who could have done this. I said I didn't know, that the fraud department was investigating, that I was trying to figure it out. Sarah asked if I'd actually been to any of these cities, Phoenix, Tampa, Charlotte, Nashville. I thought about it, tried to remember. I'd been to Charlotte once, a conference for work, maybe 2005 or 2006, before Helen died. But I'd been there for 3 days, stayed in a hotel, flew home, never looked at real estate, never met with a mortgage broker, certainly never bought a house. The other cities I'd never visited, never had any reason to go there, never been there in my life as far as I could remember. Sarah said this was serious, that I needed a lawyer, not just the bank's fraud department but my own lawyer, someone who could protect my interests, make sure I wasn't held responsible for mortgages I didn't sign, for debts I didn't owe, for properties I didn't buy. She gave me the name of a lawyer she knew, a friend from college who practiced in Columbus, specialized in fraud cases, financial crimes. She said I should call him, get legal advice, make sure I was protected. I called the lawyer the next day. His name was Michael Porter. I explained the situation, the 4 properties, the mortgages in my name, Helen's signature on documents after she died. Michael said I needed to come in, that this was complicated, that I needed legal representation. We set an appointment for later that week. Michael's office was downtown, modern building, nice reception area. He was maybe 50 years old, sharp dresser, confident. He listened to my story, looked through the documents I'd brought, asked detailed questions about Helen, about my finances, about who might have had access to my information, about whether I'd ever given anyone power of attorney, whether I'd ever authorized anyone to act on my behalf. I said no to everything. I'd never given anyone power of attorney, never authorized anyone to make financial decisions for me, never shared my social security number or financial information with anyone outside of normal banking and employment. I'd been careful, protective of my information, especially after Helen died and I was managing everything alone. Michael said this looked like sophisticated fraud, not random identity theft, but something targeted. Someone had been using my identity for 16 years, had purchased 4 significant properties, had maintained them, had made all the payments on time, had kept everything current. That suggested someone with resources, someone organized, someone who knew what they were doing. He asked if the fraud department had found anything yet. I said they were still investigating, that Karen had told me it would take time. Michael said he'd reach out to them, coordinate with their investigation, but that he'd also do his own investigation, try to track down who'd actually purchased these properties, who'd been making the payments, who'd been living in them or managing them. Michael said there was another possibility I needed to consider, that maybe this wasn't fraud. Maybe I'd actually done this, bought these properties, signed these documents, and had somehow forgotten. He said it sounded crazy, but that memory was complicated, that stress, trauma, medical issues could all affect memory, that I should consider whether there was any possibility this had actually been me. I said no, absolutely not. I would remember buying 4 houses, would remember signing mortgage documents, would remember traveling to these cities, would remember everything involved in purchasing real estate. I'd bought 1 house in my life, my house with Helen in 1984. I remembered every detail of that process, the showings, the negotiations, the inspections, the closing, every step. If I'd bought 4 more houses, I'd remember. Michael said he believed me, but that he had to ask, had to make sure. He said he'd start investigating, would file paperwork protecting my interests, would make sure I wasn't held liable for debts I didn't owe, would work with the fraud department to figure out what had happened. He said to keep gathering documentation, anything that proved where I'd been during the relevant time periods, anything that showed I couldn't have been in these other cities buying houses. I spent the next weeks going through everything, old calendars, photos, receipts, anything that showed where I'd been. I found my work calendars from 2008, the year the Phoenix house was supposedly purchased. Every day accounted for. Work meetings, appointments, ordinary routine, no gaps, no trips to Phoenix, no unexplained absences. The house in Phoenix had been purchased in March 2008. I checked my calendar for March 2008, found entries for every single day. Work, dentist appointment, dinner with Sarah. Nothing unusual, nothing indicating I'd traveled to Arizona. I did the same for the other properties. Tampa in 2010. My calendar showed I'd been at work every day that month. Charlotte in 2012. Same thing. Normal routine, no travel. Nashville in 2015, the year I'd retired. But even then, I could account for my time. Retirement party, family vacation with Sarah and her family, settling into retirement. No trip to Nashville, no house hunting, no mortgage closing. I had photos too. Family photos. Sarah's wedding in 2009, my grandson's birth in 2011, holidays, birthdays, every major event in my life during these years, all showing I'd been in Columbus, all showing I'd been living my normal life, not traveling around buying houses in cities I'd never visited. Karen from the fraud department called in April. said she'd been investigating, had contacted the mortgage companies, had requested copies of all the original documents, the signatures, the financial disclosures, everything. She'd also contacted the title companies that had handled the closings, asked for their records, photos from the closings if they had them, anything that might identify who'd actually been present. Karen said she'd received some of the documents. The mortgage paperwork showed signatures that looked like mine. Not exactly like my signature, but close enough that they'd passed scrutiny. The same with Helen's signatures. Close enough to be believable. Someone had practiced, had studied our signatures, had been able to forge them well enough to fool mortgage companies and title companies. But there was something interesting. The financial disclosures, the documents showing income and assets. They were accurate for 2008, showed my income from work, my bank account balances, my credit score, everything correct for that time period. Whoever had done this had access to my real financial information, had used accurate numbers to qualify for the mortgage, the same for the other properties. Each time, the financial information was accurate for that year. Current income, current assets. Someone had been tracking my finances, had been keeping current information, had been using it to qualify for mortgages every few years. Karen asked if I'd ever had my identity stolen before, ever had my credit compromised, ever had accounts opened in my name. I said no, never. This was the first time anything like this had happened. Karen said that was part of what made this strange. Usually, identity theft involved multiple types of fraud: credit cards, loans, tax fraud. But in my case, it was only these 4 mortgages, 4 houses, nothing else. Like someone had a very specific purpose, a specific plan. She said she'd also been investigating the properties themselves, had contacted local authorities in each city, asked them to check the houses, see who was living there, who was maintaining them. The Phoenix house was occupied, a family living there. They'd been renting it since 2009. 1 year after it was purchased, they paid rent to a property management company. The company said the owner was Robert Hayes, me, but they'd never met me, had only dealt with the property management company. Payments went to an account I didn't have access to, an account that wasn't in any of my bank records. The Tampa house was similar, rented since 2011, family living there, property management company handling everything, rent going to an account I didn't control. Charlotte was the same. Nashville was the same. All 4 properties were rented out, all generating income, all maintained through property management companies, all supposedly owned by me, but managed by someone I'd never met through accounts I didn't control. Karen said this suggested the fraud was financially motivated. Someone had been using my identity to build a real estate portfolio, to generate rental income, to build wealth using my credit and my financial information. It was sophisticated, organized, long-term, not the kind of thing someone did impulsively. Someone had planned this, had been executing the plan for 16 years, had been making money off my identity. She asked if I had any idea who might do this, who might have the sophistication to pull this off, who might have access to my information over such a long period. Said I didn't know, couldn't think of anyone. Everyone I knew was ordinary, family, friends, co-workers. None of them seemed capable of something like this. Karen said she'd keep investigating, would try to track down the property management companies, find out who was really behind them, try to identify who'd set all this up. But she warned me it might not be possible. Whoever had done this had been careful, had covered their tracks, had set up systems that were designed to be anonymous. It might be impossible to find them. Michael Porter called that same week, said he'd been doing his own investigation, had hired a private investigator to look into the properties. The investigator had visited Phoenix, had gone to the house, knocked on the door, talked to the family living there. They'd been renting for 15 years, had no idea there was anything suspicious about the property, thought they were renting from a normal landlord through a normal property management company. The investigator had also visited the property management company's office. It was a small operation, 2 employees. They'd been managing the property since 2009. Said the owner was Robert Hayes. Said he'd hired them through email. They'd never met him in person, never spoken to him on the phone. Everything was done through email. Rent payments went to an account they had routing information for. They sent monthly reports via email, got instructions via email. Never any face-to-face contact, never any phone calls, just email. The investigator had asked for copies of the emails. The property management company had provided some, all from an email address in my name, Robert Hayes 1952B. The emails were professional, detailed, gave clear instructions about maintenance, tenant issues, rent increases, everything you'd expect from a landlord. but they weren't from me. I'd never sent those emails, never communicated with that property management company, never even heard of them. Michael said this pattern was the same for all 4 properties. 4 different property management companies, 4 different cities, but all managed the same way. Email only, no phone calls, no in-person meetings. Rent going to accounts the property management companies had routing information for, but that I didn't control. Someone had set up an entire system, a system designed to be anonymous, to operate without any face-to-face contact, to generate income while staying completely hidden. Michael asked if I'd ever had email accounts hacked, ever had computers compromised, ever had anyone gain access to my online accounts. I said not that I knew of. I wasn't very sophisticated with technology, had basic email, used the internet for simple things, banking, news, nothing complicated. I'd never noticed anything suspicious, never had unauthorized access, never had passwords changed without my knowledge. But Michael said that didn't mean it hadn't happened, that someone sophisticated enough to pull off this fraud could have gained access to my accounts without me knowing, could have monitored my email, could have tracked my financial information, could have gathered everything they needed over time, could have used it to build this real estate portfolio while I remained completely unaware. He said the key question was who? Who had the sophistication? Who had the motivation? Who had access to my information? And that's what we needed to figure out. Sarah came over again. I told her what the fraud department and Michael had found. The 4 properties being rented, the property management companies, the email communications using my name, the accounts I didn't control. Sarah listened carefully, asked questions, then said something that made my chest tighten. She asked if I'd ever given anyone access to my email, ever let anyone use my computer, ever shared passwords with anyone. I said no, just Helen when she was alive. We'd shared everything. She'd had access to all my accounts, all my passwords, all my information. But Helen had died in 2007. Before any of this started, she couldn't have done this. Sarah agreed Helen couldn't have, but she asked if anyone else might have had Helen's information, Helen's passwords, Helen's access. I didn't understand what she meant. Sarah explained. She said when Mom died, someone had to handle her affairs, close her accounts, handle her paperwork, transfer utilities, all the administrative work that came after death. I'd done most of it, but Sarah had helped, had access to Helen's information, had Helen's passwords, had gone through Helen's files, had seen everything. I said yes, that was true. But so what? Sarah said she didn't know. But that maybe someone else had access too. Maybe someone who'd helped with the estate, a lawyer, an accountant, a financial advisor, someone who'd legitimately needed access to Helen's information but who'd kept it, who'd used it later, who'd realized they could use both my identity and Helen's identity to buy properties. I thought about who'd helped after Helen died. There'd been a lawyer, handled the probate, the will, transferring assets. There'd been an accountant, did our taxes that year, helped with financial reporting. There'd been Helen's sister, my sister-in-law. She'd come to help, had stayed for a few weeks after the funeral, had helped go through Helen's things, had access to everything. But none of them seemed like they'd do this. The lawyer was professional, established, had no reason to risk his career on fraud. The accountant was the same. We'd used him for years. He'd done our taxes going back decades. He was trustworthy, and Helen's sister was family. She lived in Michigan, had her own life, her own family. Why would she steal my identity? Sarah said she didn't know, was just trying to think through possibilities, trying to figure out who might have had opportunity, who might have had motive. She said maybe it was none of these people. Maybe it was someone else entirely, someone we hadn't thought of, someone who'd found a way to get my information without us knowing. Michael called a few days later, said he'd tracked down one of the bank accounts, the one that received rent payments from the Phoenix property. It had been opened in 2008, in my name, at a bank in Arizona. The account had been active since then, receiving monthly rent payments, making monthly mortgage payments, paying property management fees, everything balanced, everything maintained. 16 years of clean financial activity. But the account wasn't at any bank I'd ever used, wasn't linked to any of my other accounts, was completely separate. Someone had opened it using my information, my social security number, my driver's license number, everything needed to open a bank account. The bank had records of the account opening, had copies of the identification provided, a driver's license in my name, an Arizona driver's license, with my photo, my name, an Arizona address. Except I'd never had an Arizona driver's license, had never lived in Arizona, Had never been to the DMV there. Michael said this suggested the fraud went deeper than just mortgage documents. Someone had created fake identification, fake driver's licenses in my name for multiple states, had used them to open bank accounts, to buy properties, to build this entire system. This wasn't amateur identity theft. This was professional, organized, someone who knew what they were doing. He said tracking down fake IDs was difficult, that whoever made them had probably used sophisticated methods, that it might be impossible to trace, but that he'd keep trying, would work with authorities, would try to figure out who'd done this. The fraud department expanded their investigation. Karen told me they were now treating this as organized fraud, potentially part of a larger operation. They'd contacted federal authorities, the FBI, because the fraud crossed state lines, involved multiple financial institutions, involved fake identification. This was beyond local fraud. This was federal. An FBI agent contacted me in May. His name was Thomas Wright. He asked me to come to their office, bring all my documentation, go through everything again. I did. Spent hours at the FBI office, telling my story, showing my records, proving I'd been in Columbus, proving I hadn't bought houses in 4 other states, proving Helen had been dead when her signature appeared on documents. Agent Wright listened, took notes, asked detailed questions. He said this case was unusual. Most identity theft was opportunistic. Someone stole information and used it quickly before being caught. But this was different. This was long-term, sustained, sophisticated. Someone had been using my identity for 16 years, had built a real estate portfolio worth over $1 million, had generated hundreds of thousands in rental income, had maintained everything perfectly, no missed payments, no defaults, nothing that would trigger investigation. He asked if I'd ever worked in real estate, ever been involved in property management, ever had expertise in that area. I said no. I'd worked in manufacturing, management, operations, nothing to do with real estate. He asked if Helen had. I said no. Helen had been a teacher. We'd bought 1 house in our lives, never invested in real estate, never even thought about it. Agent Wright said that was part of what made this interesting. Whoever did this had expertise, knew how to buy properties, how to manage them, how to make them profitable. This wasn't someone flailing around. This was someone executing a plan, someone who knew real estate, knew property management, knew how to make money in rental properties. He asked about my family again. Extended family, cousins, nephews, nieces, anyone who might have real estate experience, anyone who might have had access to my information. I thought about it. My sister had a son, my nephew. He'd gone into real estate after college, worked for a development company, but he was in California, had been there for 20 years. WWE weren't close, talked maybe once a year. He wouldn't have access to my information, wouldn't have reason to steal my identity. Agent Wright said they'd investigate everyone, family, friends, co-workers, anyone in my life who might have had opportunity and expertise. He said this would take time, that I needed to be patient, but that they'd figure it out. They always did. Months passed. Summer came. I'd put off moving. Couldn't buy the condo without mortgage approval. Couldn't get approval until this was resolved. So I stayed in my house. The house that was too big, too full of memories, too hard to maintain. Waited for answers. Waited for someone to figure out who'd been using my identity, who'd been building a real estate empire in my name, who'd been making money off me for 16 years. Sarah came over regularly, checked on me, made sure I was okay, made sure I wasn't drowning in the stress of it all. She said her friend had looked into my nephew, the one in California with real estate experience. He'd started a property management company in 2007, the year Helen died, had grown it over the years, now managed dozens of properties across multiple states, including Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, Tennessee, the same states where my fraudulent properties were located. Sarah said it might be coincidence, but that it seemed suspicious, that maybe I should tell Michael, tell Agent Wright, let them investigate. I said my nephew wouldn't do this. We weren't close, but he wasn't a criminal, wasn't someone who'd steal from family. But Sarah said people did things you wouldn't expect, especially when money was involved, especially when they thought they wouldn't get caught. I called Agent Wright, told him about my nephew, about the property management company, about the states matching, about the timing, about everything. Agent Wright said they'd investigate, would look into my nephew's business, his finances, his activities, would see if there was a connection. 2 weeks later, Agent Wright called, asked me to come to his office, said they'd found something I needed to see. I drove to the FBI office, went to Agent Wright's office. He had files spread across his desk, photos, documents, bank records, He told me they'd investigated my nephew. His name was Daniel Hayes. He'd started his property management company in 2007, had incorporated it in California, but he'd expanded quickly. By 2008, he was managing properties in Arizona. By 2010, Florida. By 2012, North Carolina. By 2015, Tennessee. The same timeline as my fraudulent properties, Agent Wright showed me incorporation documents for shell companies, LLCs created in each state, all with similar names, all registered to addresses that turned out to be commercial mail forwarding services, all managed by Daniel's main property management company. And the owners of these LLCs, according to the paperwork, were various people, including Robert Hayes. Me, except I'd never created an LLC, never registered a company, never been involved in any business entity. But according to documents filed in 4 different states, I was the owner of companies that owned the properties, companies that received the rental income, companies that paid the mortgages, all managed by Daniel's property management company, all generating income that flowed through accounts I didn't control. Agent Wright said Daniel had been sophisticated, had created a network of shell companies and bank accounts, had used my identity to buy the properties because my credit was good and my financial history was clean, had used Helen's identity as co-signer to make the application stronger, had forged our signatures, had created fake identification, had opened bank accounts in multiple states, had built an entire system designed to generate income while keeping himself hidden. The rental income from the 4 properties over 16 years totaled approximately $800,000. After mortgage payments, property management fees, maintenance, and other expenses, Daniel had probably netted around $300,000. $300,000 stolen using my identity and my dead wife's identity. Agent Wright said they had enough evidence to arrest Daniel, to charge him with identity theft, wire fraud, bank fraud, and multiple other federal crimes. He'd be facing significant prison time, decades possibly. But before they arrested him, Agent Wright wanted to ask me something. Did I want to confront Daniel? Did I want to ask him why? Why he'd done this to family? Why he'd stolen from his uncle? Why he'd used his dead aunt's identity? I said yes. I needed to understand. Needed to hear it from Daniel. Needed to know why my nephew had spent 16 years stealing from me. The FBI arranged it, brought Daniel in for questioning, told him they had evidence of fraud, that he could cooperate or face charges. Daniel agreed to talk, agreed to meet with me, said he'd explain everything. They put us in an interview room. Small, table, 2 chairs, Daniel on one side, me on the other, Agent Wright in the corner watching, recording everything, making sure nothing got out of hand. I hadn't seen Daniel in years. He was 45 now, looked successful, well-dressed, confident. He'd done well for himself, built a business, made money, had a good life, all of it apparently built partially on fraud, on stealing from his uncle. I asked him why, just that, why. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he started talking, said it had started after Aunt Helen died, after the funeral. He'd come to Columbus to pay respects, had stayed a few days, had helped go through Helen's things, had seen how lost I'd been, how overwhelmed. He'd wanted to help, had offered to handle some of the administrative work, the accounts, the paperwork, the details I couldn't focus on. I'd given him access, given him Helen's passwords, her account information, her social security number, everything needed to close her accounts, transfer her assets, handle her estate. Daniel had done all of it, had been helpful, efficient, had taken care of everything so I could focus on grieving. But while doing that work, Daniel had seen my financial information too, had seen my credit score, my income, my assets, had seen that I was in good financial shape, stable, clean credit history, no debt, the kind of financial profile banks loved, the kind of profile that could qualify for mortgages easily. Daniel said he'd been struggling at the time. His property management business was new. He was trying to expand, trying to buy properties to manage, but he couldn't qualify for mortgages. His credit was okay, but not great. His income was inconsistent. Banks wouldn't loan to him. He was stuck. Couldn't grow his business without capital. Couldn't get capital without better financials. So he'd thought about using my identity. Just once. Just for one property. He'd tell himself it was a loan. That he'd pay me back eventually. That I'd never even know because he'd make all the payments. Handle everything. Keep it completely separate from my life. It would be temporary. Just until he got established. Just until his own financials improved. He'd bought the Phoenix property in 2008 using my identity, had forged my signature on the documents, had used Helen's information as co-signer even though she was dead, had opened a bank account in Arizona, had rented out the property, had made the mortgage payments from the rental income, had managed everything through his company, had kept it completely hidden from me, and it had worked. The property was profitable. The rental income covered the mortgage and expenses and left money over. Daniel had made about $15,000 that first year. Profit from a property he'd bought using my identity. Money I knew nothing about. Money he was making off my credit and my name. So he'd done it again. Tampa in 2010. Charlotte in 2012. Nashville in 2015. Each time using my identity. Each time forging signatures. Each time creating shell companies to hide ownership. Each time managing everything through his business so it stayed separate from me. 4 properties, 4 mortgages, 4 income streams, all using my name, all stealing my identity. Daniel said he'd always planned to tell me. Eventually, when the mortgages were paid off maybe, when the properties were clear, he'd deed them over to me. Give me the income. Make it right. But year after year had passed, and he'd never found the right time. Never found the courage. Never wanted to admit what he'd done. He said he hadn't thought of it as stealing. Not really, because he was making all the payments, managing everything. I wasn't losing money, wasn't being harmed. If anything, he was building assets in my name, assets that would eventually be mine, properties worth over $1 million. He'd convinced himself he was doing me a favor, building wealth I'd inherit, making money for both of us. But he also knew it was wrong, knew he'd committed fraud, knew he'd stolen Helen's identity after she died, knew he'd violated my trust, knew he'd betrayed family. He said he was sorry, that he'd never meant for it to go this long, that he'd gotten trapped in his own system, that he couldn't figure out how to come clean without destroying everything. I sat there listening to this justification, this rationalization. My nephew had stolen my identity, had forged my dead wife's signature, had built a real estate empire partially using my name, had made hundreds of thousands of dollars off me, and he was sitting there telling me he'd thought of it as helping me, as building wealth for me, as doing me a favor. I asked him if he understood what he'd cost me. Not money, but peace of mind, security, trust. I couldn't buy a condo because of what he'd done, couldn't downsize, couldn't move forward with my life. I'd spent months under investigation, had been questioned by police, FBI, fraud investigators, had to prove I wasn't a criminal, had to prove I wasn't complicit in fraud, had to prove my dead wife wasn't still alive somewhere signing mortgage documents. Daniel's face crumpled. He said he never thought I'd try to get another mortgage, never thought this would surface. He'd been so careful to keep everything separate, to make all the payments on time, to never let anything default or go into collections. He'd thought he could maintain this forever, keep the properties running, keep making money, keep me completely unaware. But he hadn't counted on me trying to move, trying to buy new property, trying to get a mortgage that would trigger a credit check that would reveal everything. His whole system had been designed to stay hidden, to operate in the shadows. My mortgage application had exposed it all. I asked him what he expected to happen now. He said he didn't know, that he'd confess to everything, plead guilty, accept whatever punishment came. He wouldn't fight it, wouldn't deny it. He'd done it. He'd take responsibility. But he also asked if I'd consider something, if I'd consider keeping the properties. They were in my name. The mortgages were in my name. Everything was legally mine already. If he went to prison, the properties would need an owner, need someone to manage them. They were profitable, were making money, would continue to make money. Maybe I could keep them, take over the management, have the income, have the assets, make something positive out of this mess. I stared at him. He'd stolen my identity, forged my dead wife's signature, committed federal crimes using my information. And now he was suggesting I keep the fruits of his fraud? That I take over properties bought through identity theft? That I profit from what he'd done? I told him no. I wanted nothing to do with those properties. Wanted them out of my name. Wanted every trace of his fraud removed from my credit. Wanted my identity back. My clean history back. My life back. Whatever happened to the properties wasn't my concern. He'd created this situation. He could figure out how to unwind it. Daniel nodded. Said he understood. Said he'd work with his lawyers and the FBI to transfer everything. To get the properties out of my name. To clear my credit. To restore my identity. It would take time, but he'd do it. He'd fix what he'd broken. Agent Wright ended the interview. Took Daniel into custody. Read him his rights. Charged him with multiple federal crimes. Daniel was arrested. Held pending trial. His lawyer negotiated a plea deal. Daniel pleaded guilty to identity theft, wire fraud, and bank fraud, was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, was ordered to pay restitution, to work with authorities to unwind the fraud, to get the properties out of my name, to restore my credit, to make me financially whole. The process took over a year. Daniel's lawyers worked with the FBI and the mortgage companies and the banks. The properties were transferred, put in Daniel's name, or sold, or foreclosed. I didn't track the details, didn't care what happened to them, just wanted them gone, wanted my name cleared, wanted my identity back. By late 2025, it was done. All 4 properties removed from my credit reports, all 4 mortgages discharged, my credit score restored, my identity clean again. Letters from the banks saying the mortgages had been fraudulent, that I wasn't responsible, that my credit history was clear. I applied for the mortgage again, for the condo, same bank, same loan officer. Jennifer remembered me, remembered the mess from before. She processed my application. This time it went through. No properties in other states, no fraudulent mortgages, no red flags, just a 73-year-old man trying to downsize after his wife died, trying to move forward with his life. The condo purchase closed in December 2025. I moved in January 2026. Sold my house, the house Helen and I had bought in 1984. The house we'd raised Sarah in. The house Helen had died in. The house I'd lived in alone for 18 years after she was gone. It was time to let it go. Time to stop living in a museum of my marriage. Time to build whatever life I had left. The condo was smaller, simpler, easier to manage. 2 bedrooms, one for me, one for when Sarah and the grandkids visited. Close to Sarah's neighborhood, close to things I needed. A good place to spend whatever years remained. Sarah helped me move, helped me pack up 42 years of life in that house. We found things we'd forgotten about. Photos from when she was little, Helen's teaching supplies, my work papers from decades ago, memories in every box, every drawer, every closet. We kept some, donated some, threw away some, made decisions about what mattered and what didn't. Sarah asked how I felt about Daniel, about everything he'd done, whether I'd forgiven him. I said I didn't know. Forgiveness felt complicated. Daniel had betrayed me, had stolen from me, had used Helen's identity after she died, had violated everything family was supposed to mean. But he'd also been young, had made a terrible choice, had gotten trapped in his own system, had spent 16 years unable to admit what he'd done. I didn't forgive him. Not yet, maybe not ever. But I also didn't hate him, didn't wish him harm, didn't want him to suffer forever. He was serving his sentence, paying his debt to society. When he got out in 6 or 7 years, maybe we could talk. Maybe we could try to understand each other. Maybe we could rebuild some kind of family connection. But for now, I needed distance, needed space, needed time to heal from what he'd done, needed to rebuild my sense of security, my sense of trust, my sense that the world made sense. Sarah said Mom would have been devastated, that Helen would have been heartbroken to know her nephew had used her identity after she died, that Helen's signature had been forged on documents years after her death, that her memory had been violated like that. I agreed. Helen would have been hurt deeply, but Helen was gone. Had been gone for 18 years. She'd been spared this pain, spared knowing what Daniel had done. I settled into the condo, started building routines, started making it feel like home. It was different from the house. Smaller, newer, less history, but that was okay. Maybe that's what I needed. A place without ghosts, without memories in every corner. A place where I could be just Robert. Not Robert and Helen, not Robert who lost Helen, just Robert, 73 years old, retired, living in a condo, building a simple life. I joined a book club, started volunteering at a community center, started doing things I'd put off for years because I'd been too focused on grief, too focused on Helen's absence, too focused on the past. Now I was trying to focus on the present, on whatever future I had left. Daniel wrote to me from prison, a letter, long, detailed, full of apologies and explanations and regrets. He said he thought about what he'd done every day, that he was ashamed, that he wished he could go back and make different choices, that he understood if I never forgave him, that he didn't deserve forgiveness, but that he wanted me to know he was sorry, truly sorry, for everything. I read the letter 3 times, then put it in a drawer. I wasn't ready to respond, wasn't ready to engage, wasn't ready to offer absolution or understanding or anything. I needed more time, maybe years, maybe forever, but I kept the letter, didn't throw it away, kept it in case someday I was ready to answer. Sarah asked if I'd tell my sisters what happened. They knew about the identity theft in general terms, knew there'd been fraud, but didn't know it was Daniel, didn't know it was family. I'd kept that part quiet, didn't want to spread the shame, didn't want to damage relationships between Daniel's mother and my sisters, didn't want to create more pain in the family. But Sarah thought they deserved to know that keeping it secret was protecting Daniel, that he didn't deserve protection, that the family needed to understand what he'd done, what he was capable of, so they could be careful, so they could protect themselves, so they could make informed decisions about trusting him when he got out of prison. I thought about it for weeks, finally decided Sarah was right. I called my sisters, told them everything, about Daniel using my identity, about the houses, about Helen's forged signature, about the 16 years of fraud, about the arrest and conviction and prison sentence. My sisters were shocked, horrified, couldn't believe Daniel would do this, couldn't believe their nephew was capable of such betrayal. Daniel's mother, my sister Linda, was devastated, called me crying, apologizing, saying she'd failed as a mother, that she'd raised him better than this, that she didn't understand where she'd gone wrong. I told her it wasn't her fault, that Daniel was an adult, that he'd made his own choices, that she'd been a good mother, that sometimes people did things that couldn't be explained by their upbringing. Linda asked if I'd visit Daniel in prison, if I'd talk to him, help him process what he'd done, help him find a way forward. I said I wasn't ready, that maybe someday but not now, that I needed to focus on my own healing before I could help Daniel with his. Linda understood, said she respected that, said she hoped eventually we could all heal from this. I'm 74 now. 2 years since the fraud was discovered. 1 year since I moved into the condo. 1 year since Daniel went to prison. 1 year of trying to rebuild my life, my sense of security, my trust in the world. Some days are better than others. Some days I barely think about what Daniel did. Focus on my book club, or my volunteer work, or visits with Sarah and the grandkids. Build a life that feels normal and stable. Other days the anger comes back, the betrayal, the violation. The sense that someone I trusted, someone family, had been stealing from me for 16 years, had been using my dead wife's identity, had been profiting off me while I remained completely unaware. Those days are harder. Those days I struggle with forgiveness, with letting go, with moving forward. Those days I sit in my condo and wonder how I missed it, how I lived my normal life while Daniel was building an empire partially using my identity, how I never suspected, never knew, never had any sense something was wrong. But most days I'm okay. Most days I can focus on what I have, rather than what was taken. I have my health, my daughter, my grandchildren, my friends, my routines, my simple life in this condo. It's not the life I'd planned, not the retirement I'd imagined, but it's mine. It's real. It's not built on fraud or lies or stolen identities. Daniel gets out in 2032. 6 more years. He'll be 51, still young enough to rebuild, to start over, to have a life after prison. I don't know if we'll have a relationship then. Don't know if I'll be ready to see him, to talk to him, to try to understand. Don't know if forgiveness will ever be possible, but I know I won't carry this anger forever. Won't let it poison the rest of my life. Won't let Daniel's choices define my remaining years. I've already lost too much time to grief and trauma and violation. I won't lose more. Helen's been gone for 18 years. I've been alone for 18 years, but I'm not lonely anymore. Not like I was in that big house full of memories. Now I'm alone, but I'm present. I'm here. I'm living. I'm building something new instead of dwelling in something dead. I went to apply for a mortgage and discovered my nephew had been stealing my identity for 16 years, had bought 4 houses in my name, had forged my dead wife's signature, had built a real estate empire partially using my credit and my reputation. It was a violation I never expected, a betrayal from family that cut deep, but I survived it, recovered from it, rebuilt after it. That's what I'll take from this story. Not the fraud or the betrayal, but the resilience. The ability to keep going even when the foundation of your life cracks. The strength to rebuild when everything you thought you knew turns out to be more complicated than you imagined. Daniel stole my identity, but he didn't steal who I am. Didn't steal my ability to move forward. Didn't steal my future. Those things remain mine. Will always remain mine, no matter what anyone else does. Did you like my story? Which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next story with love and respect.